So welcome to the first of 5 webinars. I'm going to be talking about Browntail Moth in Maine, its life history, biology, and management and current situation in Maine. So Browntail Moth is originally from Europe. It was introduced into Massachusetts, likely on some live plants, probably some rose bushes that came in to Somerville in 1897. And it's been established in Maine since 1904, so well over 100 years. And it's also in the same family as gypsy moth, which will come into play a little bit later in the presentation. There we go. Okay, so the area circled in red is the approximate native range of browntail. As you can see, it's present through quite a few latitudes and quite a few climates. Everything from southern Norway, Sweden, and Finland down to North Africa. So you may notice that this area also encompasses the latitude that we're at currently in Maine, which is why it explains why it's able to survive our coldest winters and our hottest summers. It's already co-evolved to deal with this climate. So browntail moth is not a very picky eater. It has a very wide host range, but most commonly in Maine, we see it in oaks, birch, apples, pears, any sort of fruit tree, but other hardwoods such as elm and poplar. Technically, maples are on the host list, but in the entire time that I've been in Maine, I've seen maybe 4 webs in maple, and it was always in a high infested area that had some spillover into that maple. But definitely oaks, apples, cherry, those are the ones that are probably the most preferred. Okay, so there's a lot of fuzzy caterpillars in Maine. So browntail moth is obviously on the left. So the two in the middle, eastern tent and forest tent, they're native and they have their own population controls. Sometimes they get into outbreak status, but really their native parasitoids and predators keep them in check. So probably the most distinguishing way to tell browntail moth apart from the other fuzzy caterpillars is these 2 orange dots towards the tail end, and these white tufts along each side of the body, each body segment. So eastern tent, you can see, has these peacock eye sort of markings on each segment. Forest tent caterpillar has these sort of keyhole markings all the way down. And gypsy moth, which is in the same family as browntail moth, it's a family called Erebidae, also has these 5 pairs of blue dots towards the head end, and as you get towards the tail end, there's 6 pairs of red dots. But in general, these 2 orange dots and these white tufts along the side of the body. So there is one moth caterpillar that does have 2 orange dots. These 2 guys here. So this is the white marked tussock moth, and these hairs can give people a rash if you are a sensitive individual. Generally nowhere near as bad as browntail, but it is another hairy caterpillar with 2 orange dots and somewhat toxic hairs to be aware of. Okay, so now we're gonna get into a little bit about browntail moth history. So this pile of webs next to this child, so each one of these webs is about the size of the palm of your hand, so fairly small. You can just give a wild guess about how many webs are in that pile. I always joke that this is young Rockefeller and this is how he made his first million. So back in the day, in the early 1900s, when browntail was first gaining momentum, towns would pay a bounty and school children would go throughout their town and clip out these webs from the trees in their town and bring them into the store clerk, and they would be paid a bounty, and it was 5 cents for every 100 webs they brought in. This truck down here is all these burlap sacks are again loaded with those winter webs. So remember, Browntail moth has been established in Maine since 1904, and in the U.S. since 1897. And when it first started to get established, many control measures were attempted. So winter webs were clipped and burned by the tens of thousands, as evidence from those last two pictures. Spray projects were initiated. This chart on the bottom right is some of the things that they were spraying around 1911. You can see it's quite a class of substances, everything from kerosene, tobacco, all the way to something called bug death. People cut down their apple orchards en masse because of the host preference, because it's a preferred host for browntail. This photo in the top right shows students at a farm school clipping out winter webs as part of their yearly pruning of the apples. There was also a federal quarantine that was imposed. Okay, so you can see on the bottom here the initial introduction into Somerville, Massachusetts. I've heard that it was a florist shop that received some rose plants, and that florist shop happened to be right near a railroad depot. So you go from initial introduction in 1897 to the maximum extent 17 years later. So it only took 17 years for it to get from basically its introduction to its maximum extent, all the way up into New Brunswick, basically all of New England. Even if you look on the bottom, there's a little bit on the tip of Long Island in New York. So quite an extensive move for 17 years, and it sort of supports the fact that browntail is a very good hitchhiker, just like gypsy moth, its close relative. So we had the maximum extent. In the late teens, early 20s, there was a population collapse, and so it basically went from this lighter shaded area, and then after the collapse, it sort of retreated back to this darker region by 1922, and then there was further reduction until it was basically just on a few islands off the coast of Maine, and also Cape Cod. And there was a sporadic, since that population declined in the late teens, early 20s, there was sporadic outbreaks and population reductions over the next 60 plus years. So one of the questions I usually get is that, if it was only on Cape Cod or the Casco Bay Islands, why didn't we go through and just get rid of it and clip all the webs and eradicate it? So to say that it was only in Cape Cod and on the Casco Bay Islands, it's sort of a false statement. So the most detectable populations were on those islands in Cape Cod. So unless people went through and checked every mature oak, apple, cherry, elm, poplar, it was, I will almost bet money that it was still on the main island, the mainland. Okay, so this is an excerpt from Babe Gunnell's memoir back then. Babe Gunnell was a woman who grew up in coastal Maine, in Georgetown, Maine. And at the turn of the century, she was a little girl, and she wrote about browntail moth in her memoir. I'll give you a couple of minutes to read this, but she talks about the bounty in that second paragraph, pick 100 and get 5 cents. So this was a big hit when I gave a presentation in Georgetown to see the history of browntail moth in Maine and have one of their own writing about it in her memoir later in her life. Okay, I'm going to move forward. So also with all those control efforts that were attempted in the a couple slides before, a huge biological program was also instituted. So there's a lot of parasitoid predators released, a lot of flies and wasps. So remember how I said that gypsy moth was closely related to browntail? So browntail moth, or so um, gypsy moth was intentionally introduced into the United States in 1869. There's a Frenchman that wanted to create a American silk industry by basically interbreeding domestic silk moth with gypsy moth because they were classified in the same family back then. They're they're not very close related, so obviously they did not interbreed, and they escaped his care. And when gypsy moth first started becoming a problem, a lot of parasitic flies and wasps were released to control gypsy moth. Unfortunately, they didn't vet a lot of those biological control agents, and many of them were generalists. And not only did they attack gypsy moth, but they attacked a lot of our native species. So this fly in the bottom right, Compsoglyra cantonata, is one of those generalist flies, and it would, if you guys have ever seen a cecropia moth, it's one of our largest native moths. Very beautiful, looks like a Persian carpet. So they're a lot less common now than they used to be. Same thing with Luna moth and Polyphemus moth and Promethea moth. That population reduction can be attributed to this fly, Compsoglyra cantonata. So 1870s, gypsy moth, a lot of these parasitic flies and wasps were being released for gypsy moth. Fast forward to the early 1900s when browntail moth comes on the scene, and a lot of these generalist flies and wasps then made the jump over to browntail and started attacking browntail. So it was sort of a silver lining, I guess, to having these generalists out there. Okay, so this is another little excerpt from Babe Gunnell's memoir, and in it she sort of talks about the population collapse in the late teens, early 20s, and when she said, some of these things that's such a pest for a while, something seems to take them away, and what she's likely referring to is some of these parasitic flies and wasps, but also the fungus Entomophaga allici. Entomophaga allici is not, it packs the most punch for browntail. It does attack some of our other native species, but not really on the level that it attacks browntail. So that population collapsed in the late teens, early 20s. It was likely due to a combination of this fungus Entomophaga allici, as well as those parasitic flies and wasps that were released for gypsy moth. There was another round of species of flies and wasps that were released for browntail that also helped. But this fungus probably packed the most punch. Just a side note, so since gypsy moth is probably the worst forest pest that we have in the U.S., one of the ways that the U.S. Forest Service controls that is by spraying a fungus called Entomophaga myrmica. So closely related caterpillars and closely related fungi, they're both in the same genus, these fungi. Okay, now getting into why browntail moth is such a problem. So the primary problem with browntail moth is that they are a human health nuisance. There's toxic hairs on the caterpillars, cocoons, and they pack a wallop, as evidenced by this poor woman that got a load of browntail moth hairs on the back of her neck. So these hairs are very tiny and barbed. They're also hollow. So not only if so when you get these hairs on your skin, not only are you getting a mechanical irritation from the barbs, but you're also getting a chemical irritant from that toxin that's injected. Um, they so basically these hairs can become airborne very easily, and they settle on leaves and grass and brush, and that's one of the ways that people come into contact with the hairs most often. The toxin is very stable in the environment and can last between 1 to 3 years, more if it's in sort of a sheltered area that doesn't get a lot of precipitation under somebody's deck, RVs, boat trailers, stuff that's sort of sheltered from the elements. And they can become airborne again if somebody's in there raking leaves. So the rash can last between hours to weeks. Most commonly, so the people get the rash most commonly in June and July when the caterpillars are active, but also May. And the rash can develop immediately or after a few hours, especially if you have hairs that are on your clothing and you come in from working outside and get exposed to the hairs that are on the top of your clothing. So the secondary problem with browntail is that it is a forest pest, and caterpillar feeding will cause branch dieback at about 30% defoliation, but generally trees can survive 2 or 3 years of defoliation before succumbing to the effects and dying. So a lot of these trees that have been hammered last year or the year before, most of those will flush out new leaves again, even if they've been completely defoliated. But after 2 or 3 years, it sort of wears on them a little bit. Okay, so moving into how to identify the winter webs. So there's a few different caterpillars that make webs in Maine. One of them is fall webworm. Fall webworm is native, but it's often found on some of the same hosts. So apple and cherry are favored by fall webworm. But as you can see, it's a very large nest, about the size of a football. And they're not just on the tips, they sort of encompass the whole end of the branch. But in general, they are a lot larger than browntail moth winter webs will be. So another one, eastern tent caterpillar, generally more active in the summer. These webs will be nice and fresh because the caterpillars will be active building them starting in the late spring and summer. Again, another huge nest. It's going to be about the size of a football. And most importantly, it's going to be in a different place. So it's going to be basically where the trunk meets the branches. But also one of our natives, eastern tent caterpillar, gets a bad rap because people think it's invasive, but it's actually, if you have time, look up the life history. It's very neat. They're very social, and they have some interesting behaviors. Okay, and now to the main event. So browntail moth winter webs, generally they're going to be about the size of the palm of your hand. At most, they'll be the size of your hand if they have a lot of leaves and silk incorporated, but generally no bigger than the palm of your hand. So we'll jump into the life cycle. Browntail moth winter webs can be highly variable. So as you can see, they run the gambit of everything from a leaf that's basically folded over and all the silk is on the inside. So that's on the bottom right. And then then it sort of has everything in between, everything from pure silk to some basically 2 or 3 leaves that are silked over. So they spend the winter in the webs basically is second or third instar. Now with warmer falls, they've been going into the webs in their fourth instar. So for those of you who don't know, an instar is basically just a life stage in an insect's life. So when they hatch out of the egg, their first instar, and then when they shed their skin to get a little bit bigger, their second instar, and so on and so forth. And Browntail moth has between 4 to 8 instars, depending on environmental conditions. So there can also be between 25 and 400 caterpillars per web. I have a visual in a couple of slides that I'll show you to really hammer that point home. So this is a very typical site in coastal Maine. Large mature oak trees with webs all the way up at the top. And basically a good rule of thumb is if you want to determine if they're winter webs in the trees or they're just leaves that are hanging on, early or probably about midwinter, like December, go out into the yard and on a nice sunny day with the sun to your back, look up into the trees, and those webs will shine sort of a whitish silvery color. And that'll tell you, that'll give you a good indication about how many webs are in those trees. Okay, so to give you an idea of how many caterpillars are in each web, so this is a web that I brought into the lab for a couple weeks to see what the emergence levels were. So all of those little sprinkles in there are browntail moth caterpillars, and all of those caterpillars came out of that one single web. So generally when we're telling people, even if you can only reach a couple of webs, a handful of webs, to clip them out, because that'll be that many less caterpillars per web that you'll be disposing of. So fast forward to this time of the year, when it starts becoming about 50 degrees out during the day pretty reliably, the caterpillars will start to emerge. Typically that's mid to late April. And so they'll come out, they'll start feeding on the foliage. If the buds have not started opening up yet, they will mine out the buds. So this photo on the right is you can see a little browntail moth caterpillar down by the thumb. And these dark areas up here are basically where caterpillars have gone through and mined out the bud because the leaves weren't open yet. So that's another way that they cause damage, is by mining the buds out. So from mid to late April, they're going to start feeding on the foliage, and they'll feed on that foliage until late June or early July. And like I said before, they're going to molt 5 to 8 times during that period of time. So the cast skins, so each time the caterpillar sheds its skin to grow larger, those cast skins will have toxic hairs on them. So caterpillars have toxic hairs, the shed skins have toxic hairs, and the cocoons have toxic hairs, which is the next slide. So in late June or early July, the caterpillars are going to start moving around and looking for a nice sheltered place to pupate. So often they'll do that on people's houses. They'll be swarming people's houses, and we'll get a lot of calls in late June, early July. They'll sort of spin a cocoon underneath the eaves. A lot of times they will also spin that pupal cocoon right on the tree. And what those cocoons on the tree look like are basically sort of a bunch of leaves silked loosely together, as you can see on this bottom right-hand picture, and this one in the center. So sort of loosely silked together leaves. There can be multiple individuals pupating in each one of these leaf shelters. Typically, a lot of the pupal nests that I've looked at have 2 or 3 caterpillars per pupal cocoon, and so just remember also when they're shedding that skin and turning into pupa, they're basically impregnating that silk in the cocoon with those toxic hairs. They're at a very vulnerable life stage, and that's just another way to defend against vertebrate predators. Okay, and then later on in July, the adult moths are going to emerge. This is why they're called browntail moth. Their abdomen is covered in these brown hairs. So those are not the toxic hairs you have to worry about. We always sort of caution that when a moth is coming out of its pupal cocoon, it might pick up some of those toxic hairs on the cocoon, but those brown hairs on the abdomen are not the ones you have to worry about. So adult moths are attracted to lights with peak activity between 10 p.m. and midnight, which is why we tell people if you're living in a highly infested area to turn your lights off at night to prevent yourself from artificially increasing your population in your yard. So we do have anecdotal evidence that is heavily weighted to males. Basically, for every 15, 20 males, there's only one female that gets attracted to the light. Typically, the females are hanging out on the host vegetation, sort of just out of the reach of the light. So a lot of people ask me, are bug zappers a really effective way to control browntail? And the effect is actually the opposite of what they might think. It might be bringing browntail into your yard versus eradicating them. Also, stuff like bug zappers kill a lot of beneficial insects that might be attacking browntail moth. A lot of parasitic wasps come to lights. So it's just a good idea to keep your lights off at night in the summer, especially in that July to August range. Okay, once the adult moths have mated, the females are gonna lay eggs in mid to late July, and they're gonna be deposited on the leaves of the host tree. So again, oaks, apples, cherries, elm, poplar, all that good stuff. So you can see in this photo, there's an egg mass here that is hatching. So this hatching will occur in August. So you can see these little tiny caterpillars coming out from the egg mass. They'll feed gregariously, basically up until they go into their winter dormancy. So in each one of these egg masses, there's 200 to 400 eggs. The females will cover them in hairs from their abdomen. Again, not the toxic hairs you have to worry about. It's just a sort of a mechanical layer to prevent parasitic wasps or vertebrate predators from attacking that egg mass. And we also have anecdotal evidence to suggest that they prefer trees that haven't been defoliated the previous spring, but in a really high population level, they will basically go right onto the same trees that were defoliated earlier in the spring. So in late summer, early fall, those caterpillars are going to be feeding gregariously, and they don't necessarily defoliate. They don't necessarily eat the entire leaf. Basically, what they're doing is going through and grazing on the leaf surface, which will kill the leaf. And when the leaf dies, it basically turns this copperish, bronzy color. And we, on our late summer, early fall aerial detection surveys, you can pretty readily pick up that bronzing. It does stand out more than you would think against just normal leaf change. So during this late summer, early fall stage, they're going to start building that winter web that they're going to spend the winter in. And so they're feeding communally, and they're also building that web communally. So this is just a summarized version of all the slides that we went through for the life cycle. Takeaway message here is the highest risk exposure for hares is going to be from late April, early May through July. So just to be aware. So the current situation in Maine, last year, as many of you remember, we did have a very cool wet spring, especially in May and June. And we did see a lot of localized population collapses due to those pathogens, specifically Entomophaga alaki, that fungus that attacks browntail. Um, and we're hoping that there's a repeat of those conditions, especially in May and June. Those are sort of the key months. So winter web surveys that we completed this winter indicate that Knox, Hancock, and Waldo counties are going to see the highest population. This is the risk map for 2020. And as you can see, Belfast, Lincolnville, Camden, Rockport area, it's going to be really high. So if you look down the coast to like Yarmouth and Freeport, most of those are typically red. That area sort of has a high population all the time. We usually call that the core area. Due to that fungus, those fungal outbreaks that we had in those areas, we did see a reduction of webs, and there's about half as many webs as we saw last year. Unfortunately, that's not the case for up the coast in those areas that I mentioned. Also, something to note is on these web surveys down east, we did pick up some towns that had very low levels of webs on the Canadian border in Calais and Lubec. So we've alerted our Canadian colleagues to the fact that they might have browntail with them. This is an older graph, but it sort of shows you how quickly browntail moth shot up. So this current outbreak started in 2015, and this is acreage defoliated from browntail moth that we picked up during our aerial surveys. And in the preceding decades, at most it was 11,000 acres. And in 2018, we jumped up to 126,000 acres. So quite an increase. So those population collapses that I mentioned before, these are some of the towns that we saw these population collapses in, and we hope to see this list of towns grow this year. So this brings me to my next topic. So it's some of these towns, there were arborists that called me up and basically said that, you know, we came to treat this person's property. There's dead caterpillars everywhere. We didn't treat, the neighbors didn't treat. And I would get the address from them and go and verify it. And sure enough, it was this fungus attacking browntail moth. So that network of observers is very important, very key. So I'm using this to solicit your help this coming spring if we do have these cool wet conditions. If you do see dead and dying caterpillars, let me know, because we just got a federal grant funded, and part of that grant is assisted disease dispersal and disease monitoring. So if you're wondering what these diseased caterpillars look like, they will be a little bit more lethargic, and they'll be sort of puffy and swollen, and they'll sort of have a whitish tinge to them. So all of these caterpillars have been killed by Entomophaga alaki, and you can see all these they look a little bit dusty, especially these top two pictures. Those are caterpillars that have started producing spores. And it really only takes one spore landing on the exoskeleton of these caterpillars to grow in and kill it over the next week or so. So I'm sure there'll be questions about this at the end, but keep an eye out for these puffy, lethargic looking caterpillars. So this is in front of my house, and there's still evidence out there of these fungal outbreaks. So on this branch nub, it's sort of almost melted into the branch, but you can see these the outline of a caterpillar, and these spiky hairs here. So this is a caterpillar that was killed by Entomophaga, and as you can see, still hanging on in the middle of the winter. So just keep an eye out. Also, so this is another picture of some caterpillars that were killed by the fungus. Often, as the body sort of decays and it gets wet from the rain, they'll sort of have a really spiky appearance. So it'll look like just a pile of hairs, and that's also another indication that it was killed by that fungus. These are just some shots of our early summer survey, aerial survey, and this is over in Camden. You can see these sort of grayish areas here alongside the lake. So those are the most apparent in this photo, but this defoliation, this sort of brownish grayish color sort of went all the way up into these hills around Camden. So a lot of defoliation in that area. Will probably again experience pretty severe defoliation this year, unless we have a big outbreak of that fungus in that area. This is just another shot, and as you can see, these large stands of oaks were defoliated pretty heavily, and it was sort of backed up by the number of calls that I received from this area. Pretty bad out there. So just some notes about moving browntail, especially when you're out doing field work and traveling to many different sites. Try not to park near infested ornamental trees or trees that could serve as hosts, such as parking under oak trees and stuff like that. A lot of these parking lots have ornamental crabapple trees and apple trees. Those are also very good hosts. So just sort of try not to park under any trees or near any trees that might harbor these caterpillars. So as you saw at the beginning of the presentation, browntail moth is extremely good at hitchhiking. It basically encompassed parts of southern Canada and almost all of the Northeast in just 17 years, and it hasn't changed its habits too much. So there's sort of satellite population. This is sort of older data now, but in Burnham, Bangor, and Eddington, all those little satellite populations are anecdotally tied to people that have either second homes on the coast or that go camping on the coast, and they unknowingly brought browntail moth caterpillars or pupa back home with them and started these satellite populations. This was taken a couple of years ago by Regina when she was doing our browntail moth winter web survey. So it's a little hard to see, but in that circled area, there's 4 or 5 winter webs. And the clue to how they got there is in this picture. This camper down here at the bottom left. So what likely happened is these people went camping in an infested area during that peak time in May and June, and unknowingly brought browntail moth with them back and started a satellite population. So some precautions and personal protection. Obviously, you're going to want to avoid exposure to hairs and then avoid places that are really heavily infested by caterpillars. One thing that a lot of people forget is you're going to want to, if you're living in an infested area, you're going to want to dry your laundry inside and not out on the clothesline, because again, those hairs are very easily airborne, and you don't want to get them in your bed sheets and be in bed with browntail moth. It is a itchy affair, I assure you. Okay, so again, touching upon the toxin being extremely stable, the hairs becoming easily airborne again. Most people come into contact with browntail moth hairs when they're gardening or moving brush or chipping brush or opening up their camp or cottage. Areas like under decks and beneath trailers and RVs and cars that haven't moved a long time, that don't receive a lot of precipitation, those are the areas that you really got to worry about, because the hairs are nice and dry and ready to become airborne. So some PPE, coveralls, clothes at the neck, wrists, and ankles. Taping any of those seams would be helpful. Respirating goggles, wearing a hat, gloves. One thing that we've noticed is pre-contact poison ivy wipes do help some of the hairs from getting stuck in, because they close your pores. So these pre-contact poison ivy wipes, I believe Technu is one of the big brands that we have. That's something that you would put on your skin so that it closes your pores, so that the poison ivy oils don't get into them. And we've heard that it also helps with browntail. So when you're working outside at your personal residence, you're going to want to wet down the area with a hose, or work on days right after it's rained, so that those hairs stay stuck on the ground. Believe me, I know mowing your lawn the day after it rained or when it's got a heavy dew on it is an exercise in frustration. So one of the big questions that I get is that when the caterpillars are moving around in late May and June, they're crawling on people's houses and they're asking, how do I combat these caterpillars? One of the things you can do is get a wet dry vac with a really good HEPA filter on it, and you can put a couple of inches of soapy water in the bottom of that, and basically, so the filter will prevent the hairs from being blown out and becoming airborne again, and that couple inches of soapy water in the bottom will also trap some of the hairs, but also kill the caterpillars at the same time. And again, if you know that you're sensitive, wear all those, wear a gloves, mask, all that. A couple of notes on management. So like I mentioned before, cold winter temperatures don't kill browntail moth. They're coming from the same basic latitude that we are here in Maine. So they're adapted to our coldest winters and our warmest summers. So cool wet springs, like we did have last year, do help give some control to browntail. And there's the fungus Entomophaga allicate that I mentioned, and there's also a a virus that attacks browntail that also proliferates in those cool, wet conditions. So typically May and June are the best, the most crucial times to have those to have that cool, wet weather. Winter webs can be pruned out basically from November all the way up until mid-May, or until mid-April. So around mid-April, that's when they start emerging and coming out, and the risk of exposure to the hairs increases pretty dramatically. And they're also out foraging, so you might not be getting them all. So the time pretty much for winter pruning has passed. The reason why we tell people to prune in the winter is they're highly visible. All the caterpillars are in the webs. Risk coming in contact with the hairs is very low. So all good reasons to clip during the winter. And when people do clip out the webs, you're going to want to make sure that you destroy them and not just leave them on the ground. Browntail caterpillars are very, very good at finding food, and even if they're very small caterpillars, they have a pretty high will to survive and will climb back up on the tree. So in order to destroy them, you're going to want to soak them in a bucket of soapy water for a couple of days, or burn them. It could be a nice family activity to burn the webs that you clip out. And again, you're going to want to do this before mid-April. So chemical control in the spring, typically before the end of May. if you wait any later than the end of May, the caterpillars are going to be large, and you're not really going to be reducing your risk of coming in contact with the hairs. So this is more for homeowners, but the effective spraying and treating is more effective if the control is widespread. So if your neighbors are doing it, yeah. And if you do decide you want to go chemical treatment, make sure that you're hiring a licensed pesticide applicator, and a list of those are available on our Maine Forest Service website. Okay. So these are termed biorational pesticides, and they're the reason why they're called that is because they're derived from a quote unquote natural method. So these three are the most common biorational pesticides used for browntail. Spinosad is something that a lot of organic farmers use. It's more of a generalist insecticide, and it affects their nervous system, and it's derived from a bacterium that's subjected to a fermentation process in order to get the active ingredient. Bacillus thuringiensis corsacki, or BTK, is a soil bacterium that produces a protein that basically erodes the gut of caterpillars, so butterfly and moth larvae, and causes them to die through either desiccation or secondary infection. It's specific only to butterfly and moth larvae. It's got to be ingested to be effective. A lot of people ask, what about monarchs and all that, all of our native caterpillars. So that's one way that the life cycle of browntail moth sort of is favorable for this. Most of our native butterfly and moth larvae, they don't overwinter as larvae. So gypsy moth, the other invasive, overwinters as egg masses. So generally, so our natives are either overwintering as eggs, or they're overwintering as pupa. It's sort of unusual for our native caterpillars to overwinter as caterpillars like browntail moth does. So at the time that you're treating for browntail moth caterpillars, monarchs have basically just started their trek north, and a lot of our other natives are still eggs or pupa. And the third one is ataractin. So it's another product derived from the neem tree. You may have heard of neem oil. This azadirachtin is obtained from the seed kernels of the neem tree. Yeah, and then this last slide is basically just the pros and cons of the different methods of treatment. So chemical spray, BT spray, injections, and pruning. I believe this will all be available after the presentation, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
Tom, I've got a question. When the moths are, or when the caterpillars have just started feeding, there's something about their returning to the web for some period once they've just first started feeding. So when does that stop? If they're feeding but they're returning to the web early on?
I don't have a concrete answer. It's typically, I would say that it's typically in mid-May in a normal year. If they emerge in mid-April, typically mid-May. It's usually when most caterpillars that are gregarious as larvae, once they reach a certain instar, they sort of go more solitary. And because if you think about it evolutionarily, a lot of large caterpillars together feeding gregariously is sort of bad. It basically creates a pool that a lot of parasitoids and predators can come find them. So I would say that it would probably be like mid-May, late May is when they start moving away.
Okay, so does that mean that, for example, an early morning pruning might still capture most of the larvae if you were doing it, now, for example?
Yeah, so this year is a little different. We've been actually getting cooler than normal temperatures, so a lot of the browntail haven't even started emerging from their webs. So technically, yes, you could still prune, but I know that we're supposed to be getting some nicer weather rather soon.
My other question was, do you have a sense? I mean, we've gotten a lot of questions from homeowners of the, are there applications, stem injection or drilling or that sort of thing that homeowners can do on their own without hiring a licensed applicator, stuff that's available over the counter?
Yeah, definitely. So those are probably the most frequent calls that I've gotten this year so far is people wanting to do their own injections. And there are um, some products available online. I think one of them is called Ace Caps, and basically they sort of look like a little uh, pipe that you would smoke tobacco out of, except they're shorter, made out of plastic, and where the tobacco would go, that's a reservoir with the pesticide in it. And I've been informed that they used to be just passive systems, but they're pressurized now. They have a little septum in there, and when you tap them into the tree, they'll release the pesticide in a pressurized manner. Does anybody have any other questions? Stunned into silence, I see.
Hey Tom, here's a question just out of curiosity. You had some fun historic stuff in there. Did you ever come across any like old-timey remedies for what they used to do about the skin reactions and stuff way back in the day?
I actually haven't come across any of the old remedies. One of the things that I would feel that stems from that period. So a lot of the concoctions that some of these coastal pharmacies whip up, a lot of them have witch hazel as an ingredient in them, and I think witch hazel has some anti-inflammatory properties. So that's probably one that they were using back then.
Cool, thanks.
From
I guess I'll ask one more, which is sort of the $1 million question that people, at least in the mid coast, are asking, which is, do we have any kind of time frame for when this outbreak might collapse? Is there any hope of it, collapsing as the 19 teens outbreak did, or based on what's going on in the so-called core areas? Is there any kind of prognosis?
Yeah, so yeah, that is the $1 million question. It's almost like predicting the weather, and it is exactly like predicting the weather with these cool, wet springs. So just generally speaking, with forest pests in general, they're usually on like a 7 to 10 year cycle, and a lot of people. So you saw in that graph from 2015, it was sort of like a buildup until you got to peak, and we're kind of still in peak. On the other side of that slope, on the downhill slope, basically, it's not like jumping off a cliff and the populations go back to quote unquote normal. It takes a few years, 2 or 3 years, for it to sort of ride that other side of the curve. And what I'm hoping is that last year was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of that down cycle. And if we get another cool, wet May and June, it will be very, very good for for being on that downhill curve. But yeah, typically I say 7 to 10 years, but it's highly variable with any forest pest.
Tom, I have a question. Do you want to speculate at all about climate change and warmer falls and how that will, warmer, longer autumns, how that will potentially affect browntail?
Definitely. So Dr. Ellie Groden and her graduate student Carla Boyd have done a lot of the most recent work on browntail in Maine. And what they have been finding is that these, everybody's noticed that basically September is another month of summer, and fall doesn't really even start until October. So these warmer falls and extended summers are really, really good for browntail, because it means that before they would have from August to, the beginning or middle of September, and they would, they'd only be able to feed for that month or so. Now they're getting basically a whole nother month, and we've been seeing caterpillars out in early October if it's warm enough feeding. So they're able to typically in the past they've been in second or third instar. So small caterpillars, we've been seeing a lot now with these warmer falls. Since they have that another month, they're going into these webs in their fourth instar, which is still a small caterpillar, but fourth instar is when they start getting those toxic hairs. So it's problematic. And since we are having milder winters, not that cold mortality is a huge factor, but even less of them are dying from winter mortality, and they're coming out, bigger, stronger, ready to eat, and it's bad news bears. Good question.
Hey, Tom, this is Jan. Couple of questions. I remember Allison telling me last year, I think, that there was some mortality associated with the azadirachtin injections. Is that true? And do you know why? Sorry, I've got a kid talking in the background too.
No worries. So Ellie's, those were from Ellie's research plots. So some of these trees that she was injecting in her test trials were older trees in a cemetery, and I don't know if she was 100% positive that it was these injections that caused the death, or if it was the stress of browntail, the droughts that we've had, the 2 summers previous to that, or they were just old trees and everything conspired against them. I would have to double check to see if any more of the trees that she did in that survey died, but I do remember her saying that there was a couple.
Okay. And then the other question I had was also related to Ellie's work. Is there any progress with the compound that she was looking at spraying on the winter webs to break down the winter webs?
Yeah, so I helped in that experiment. So there was, basically, to give some background to everybody, we were trying to basically figure out a novel way to control browntail by maybe degrading the silk in some of their winter webs to maybe let some more precipitation in the cold weather and to maybe kill them. So we tested a number of commercially available detergents or some chemicals that are added to spray operations to help the pesticide stick, and most of those are sort of detergents. And we didn't really find good results with any of that, except there was this chemical called Orange Guard, and I think it's forgot its exact use, but I think it is like a natural pesticide that's available to homeowners. It's made out of orange peels, and the webs that we sprayed that on, it was basically 100% mortality in those webs. But it wasn't degrading the silk. It was penetrating the web and killing the caterpillars inside. So, and I don't think she ever wanted to test that out on another level because, well, she did. So when we initially did these trials, we soaked the webs with a lot of fluid, a lot of one of these detergents. So that was just to see if anything happened. And then she did a subsequent experiment where she took other webs and sort of stepped down the dose to see if it would be effective at a commercial application rate. And I don't think that it was effective at a lower level.
Tom, is there any thought at all about the sort of geographic scale of the outbreak, whether it's likely to continue to move northward and eastward, and if so, is there a corresponding time lag in reaching the peak and hopefully being on the downward slope, so that new areas are becoming infected, and then sort of following at a, you know what I'm saying, following along on some kind of lag?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a really good question. So I would expect it to continue to expand as long as there is available hosts out there. Unless, so that on the risk map, you saw that red area, and then below that was more of an orange area. So when the fungus took effect last year, it was sort of a donut hole. It affected that core area, and it sort of more or less didn't touch the area that's now in red. And so if this year, if we don't have a cool, wet May and June and don't have that fungal outbreak, it will probably keep expanding. But if we do, I have a feeling that the fungus will catch up to that leading edge, basically. And one of the things that that grant that we got is assisted disease dispersal. So I'm going to be keeping an eye out in that sort of core area, Yarmouth, Cumberland, Freeport area. That's where you usually see caterpillars infected first, and then you see it later up the coast. So keep an eye out for the earliest, and then take those caterpillars, drive them up to different release locations, and then monitor that throughout the rest of the field season, and then come back the following year and see if we've had any success with that. So something I'm working on.
So if we find some sick caterpillars, you want them?
Yes, definitely. And like I said before on those slides, any of the district foresters, any of you guys that are out in the field, if you see caterpillars that are sickly, let me know, and I'll come down and verify. And if it is, I'll collect a bunch to bring up. The more the merrier.
So if we notice some in our area, do we report them to you? I've noticed them in Old Town, but I haven't noticed them up here in Lincoln yet. But Old Town to Lincoln's only 45 miles. So
are you talking about like just caterpillars in general, or
caterpillars in general? Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at that risk map, if you see webs that are out of those known areas, definitely let us know. And even if it is like on the periphery, if we have trace populations, it would still be good to know about those. So you can send those emails to me of reports and with like an address or GPS points.
Okay.
Good.
Yep.
Should we also be
Tom.
sending?
Oops. Sorry.
I just wanted. Should we also be sending others to, like citizen reports? Send those directly to you, or use the website?
Probably for the public, it would be good to use the website. I'm going to turn on the SurveyMonkey link probably right after this call, so that they can report those. I think we put a new field in there for, or we put a requirement if they are seeing it on the periphery.
Sorry, Tom, it's Allison. Just
Hey.
didn't hear all of it. I was wondering if you had mentioned that the winter web survey map is up as well and can be loaded into Avenza.
I didn't. So on the Browntail page on the Maine Forest Service website, there's 3 links. So we coupled the BTM risk map, BTM winter web survey, and there was the 3rd map. I think it was the aerial survey data map. So all 3 of those are available, and like Allison said, you can download them into Avenza. So that winter web survey map that has all the points and their corresponding data with where we picked it up during the survey.
So is that existing stuff that you already have, or is that a place where we can add something in?
That's existing stuff. So it's just
Okay.
sort of give you a reference to where we know it is.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Tom, this is Colleen again. This is possibly a question that there isn't an answer to, but is there any speculation on why browntail has historically been just in the Maritimes and the New England states, and why, if it's such a good hitchhiker, it hasn't gone elsewhere? Does it have to do with our climate? Does it have to do with trade back in the 19 teens when, where people were going? Are there any guesses?
Yeah, so it's probably not due to trade, because we're a lot more mobile than even back then. So Joe Elkington did some research, and Carla and Ellie also did some research, and they sort of, both their results sort of contradict each other. So one of what's basically kept it from expanding out, what it's theorized, is that these parasitic flies and wasps are giving control. They're well established out in the inland, and these parasitic flies, especially like Compsoglyra consonata, and there's another couple of flies that attack browntail. They don't do very well for some reason in that coastal microclimate. So that's one possible explanation, and it seems like the best one that we have at this point. Anybody else? All right, well, I will not hold you here. Yeah, so tune in next Monday for the next installment in our Forest Health webinar series. Thank you guys so much for attending and not getting distracted by this mop. But yeah, take it easy, guys. Stay well.
Thanks, Tom. That was really good.
Really appreciate it. All right. Take care, folks.